Thunder's hooves kicked up clouds of red dust as Beth Carter guided her horse along the rocky ridge that marked the eastern boundary of her family's ranch on New Terra. The twin suns hung low in the alien sky, casting long shadows across the strange purple grass that grew in patches between the familiar earth crops her grandfather had brought when the first colonists arrived 3 generations ago. Beth pulled her wide-brimmed hat down to shield her eyes from the harsh light, reflecting off the crystalline formations that jutted from the canyon walls like frozen lightning. She had been riding fence lines since dawn, checking for breaks in the energy barriers that kept the more dangerous native wildlife away from the cattle. New Terra might look like the old American West with its vast open spaces and rugged terrain, but the similarities ended there. This world had creatures that could phase through solid matter, plants that sang warnings when storms approached, and weather patterns that could change from scorching heat to freezing cold in minutes. Beth's great-grandmother had been one of the original settlers, part of the massive exodus from Earth when the home planet became too crowded and polluted to support its population. The colonists had chosen New Terra because its day-night cycle and gravity were similar to Earth, even though everything else about the planet seemed designed to challenge human survival. 3 generations later, families like the Carters had carved out successful ranches and farms, but it required constant vigilance and adaptation. Thunder suddenly stopped and pricked his ears forward, snorting nervously. Beth listened carefully, her hand moving instinctively to the plasma rifle secured to her saddle. Living on the frontier meant always being ready for trouble, whether from territorial disputes with neighboring ranches or encounters with New Terra's less friendly native species. But instead of the growl of a predator or the whine of approaching vehicles, she heard something else entirely, a weak cry, echoed from somewhere below in the narrow canyon that cut through the ridge like a wound in the planet's surface. The sound was unlike anything Beth had heard in her 25 years on New Terra. It wasn't the call of any known animal, nor was it mechanical. There was something almost musical about it, a series of notes that seemed to tug at something, deep in her chest. Beth dismounted and secured Thunder's reins to a sturdy crystal formation, then carefully made her way down the steep slope into the canyon. The walls rose high on either side, creating a twilight world where the twin suns could barely penetrate. Bioluminescent moss clung to the rocks, providing an eerie blue-green glow that made everything look underwater. The crying sound came again, closer now and definitely coming from ahead where the canyon narrowed even further. Beth moved cautiously, her boots finding purchase on the uneven stone floor. She had explored many of New Terra's canyons over the years, but this one felt different. The air itself seemed to shimmer with an energy she couldn't identify, and the usual small creatures that lived in these shadowy places were nowhere to be seen. As she rounded a bend in the canyon wall, Beth stopped dead in her tracks. Huddled against a pile of fallen rocks was a creature no bigger than a house cat, but clearly not of Earth origin. Its body was covered in scales that shifted color from deep blue to emerald green as it moved, and 2 small wings protruded from its back, though one appeared to be badly torn. A long tail with a diamond-shaped tip curled around its body, and its head was distinctly reptilian, but with large, intelligent eyes that reflected the moss light. Like liquid gold, the creature looked up at her approach and made that musical crying sound again. Beth could see that one of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Dark fluid that might have been blood seeped from several wounds along its flanks. Despite its obvious pain and fear, the little creature didn't try to flee or bare any teeth or claws. Instead, it simply watched her with those enormous golden eyes, as if trying to judge whether she represented salvation or just another threat. Beth had grown up hearing stories about the dragons of New Terra. The indigenous species had been observed from a distance by the early colonists, but they were incredibly rare and avoided all contact with humans. Most people believed they were just another type of flying predator, no more intelligent than the hawk-like creatures that sometimes raided chicken coops. But looking at this injured baby, Beth could see an awareness in its gaze that spoke of something much more complex. She slowly removed her jacket and approached, the creature with gentle movements speaking in the same soothing tone she used with frightened horses. The little dragon didn't resist as she carefully wrapped it in the warm fabric. though it made small distressed sounds when she accidentally jostled its injured wing. Beth could feel its tiny heart beating rapidly against her chest as she cradled it, and she was surprised by how warm it was, not feverish but radiating heat like a small furnace. The journey back up the canyon wall was treacherous with her hands full, but Beth managed to reach Thunder without further injuring her unexpected patient. The horse was skittish about the dragon's scent at first, but Beth's calm voice settled him enough to allow her to mount while still holding the creature. As they rode back toward the ranch house, the little dragon seemed to relax slightly, its breathing becoming less labored. Beth's mind raced with questions as Thunder carried them across the darkening landscape. How had such a young creature ended up alone and injured in that remote canyon? Where were its parents? And what was she supposed to do with an injured dragon? Anyway, there were no veterinarians on New Terra trained to treat alien species, and the nearest medical facility was a 3-day ride to the territorial capital back at the ranch house. Beth cleared a space in the kitchen and laid the dragon on soft towels. By lamplight, she could see its injuries more clearly. The broken leg would need to be splinted, and the torn wing carefully cleaned and bandaged. She had treated injured animals before, but this was entirely different. The dragon's anatomy was unlike anything in her experience, and she worried that human first aid techniques might do more harm than good as she worked, cleaning wounds with warm water and antiseptic. The little creature watched her every movement. Several times it made soft chirping sounds that seemed almost like attempts at communication. When Beth accidentally pressed too hard on a sensitive area, the dragon didn't snap or scratch. Instead, it simply looked at her with what she could only interpret as reproach, as if to say it understood she was trying to help, but wished she would be more careful. The most challenging part was setting the broken leg. Beth had to improvise a splint from wooden coffee stirrers and medical tape, all while the dragon held perfectly still as if it understood the necessity of the procedure. When she finished, she offered it water from an eyedropper and was relieved when it drank eagerly. But what did baby dragons eat? She tried warm milk, and to her surprise, the creature accepted it readily, lapping it up with a surprisingly delicate tongue. As the night wore on, Beth found herself talking to the dragon as she worked. She told it about the ranch, about her family's history on New Terra, about how she had always felt more comfortable with animals than with most people. The dragon seemed to listen, its golden eyes following her face as she spoke. Once, when she paused in her story about training Thunder, the dragon made a sound that was unmistakably a question. By dawn, the dragon was resting comfortably in a makeshift nest of blankets near the kitchen stove. Beth had decided to call it Spark, partly because of the tiny puffs of flame it occasionally exhaled when startled. She sat in her kitchen chair, exhausted but oddly content, watching the small creature sleep. She had no idea that this moment of kindness would change not just her life, but the entire future of human-dragon relations on New Terra. Outside, the twin suns were rising again, beginning another day on the frontier. But this morning felt different somehow, charged with possibilities that Beth couldn't yet imagine. Strange dreams of flying over crystalline mountains and ancient songs filled Beth's restless sleep, but it was the sound of creaking wood that finally woke her. The old ranch house groaned and settled in the wind sometimes, especially during temperature changes, but this was different. These sounds came in a rhythm, like something very heavy shifting its weight from one foot to another just outside her bedroom window. Beth sat up in the pre-dawn darkness, instantly alert. Years of frontier living had trained her to wake fully and quickly when something wasn't right. The creaking came again, accompanied by what sounded like the soft scrape of claws against wooden planks. Her first thought was that one of the larger native predators had somehow gotten past the energy fence, but the sounds were too controlled, too careful for a wild animal. She slipped from her bed and padded barefoot to the kitchen, where Spark still slept peacefully in his nest of blankets. The little dragon had recovered remarkably quickly overnight, his breathing steady and strong, though he still favored his splinted leg. Beth checked the window above the sink and felt her heart nearly stop at what she saw outside. An enormous dragon sat on her veranda like a patient visitor, waiting for calling hours. In the dim light of New Terra's twin moons, Beth could make out the creature's massive form, easily 30 feet from nose to tail, with wings that when folded still stretched beyond the edges of the covered porch. The dragon's scales held the same blue-green coloration as Spark's, but deeper and more lustrous like polished gemstones. Most remarkably, the great beast sat with perfect stillness, her intelligent amber eyes fixed on the kitchen window, as if she knew exactly where to look. Beth's mouth went dry as she realized what she was seeing. This had to be Spark's mother, drawn here by some instinct or ability that human science didn't yet understand. The adult dragon could have torn the ranch house apart with her claws or incinerated it with her breath, but instead she waited with the patience of someone who understood proper manners. Her massive head tilted slightly as she noticed Beth at the window, but she made no threatening moves. Moving slowly to avoid startling either dragon, Beth lifted Spark from his blanket nest. The little creature stirred and chirped softly, then suddenly became very alert as he apparently sensed his mother's presence. His golden eyes grew wide with excitement, and he began making urgent musical sounds that were clearly attempts to communicate. Beth had faced down stampeding cattle, territorial disputes with neighboring ranchers, and the occasional raid by off-world pirates, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for walking onto her front porch to meet a creature of legend. She took a deep breath, settled Spark more securely in her arms, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The mother dragon's presence was overwhelming up close. She radiated heat like a massive furnace, and Beth could feel the power contained in those enormous muscles. But when the great creature looked down at Spark, her fierce amber eyes softened with unmistakable maternal love. She lowered her massive head and began making the same musical sounds that Spark had been producing, though deeper and more complex. The reunion between mother and child was touching in a way that transcended species. The adult dragon gently nuzzled Spark with her enormous snout, careful not to dislodge his splint or disturb his healing wing. She examined his injuries with delicate precision, her nostrils flaring as she scented his condition. Spark responded with a series of chirps and whistles that sounded remarkably like a child telling his mother about his adventures. Beth stood frozen, not wanting to interrupt this intimate moment, but also unsure whether she should retreat back into the house. The decision was taken from her when the mother dragon suddenly focused her attention entirely on her. Those ancient amber eyes studied Beth with an intelligence that was clearly equal to or greater than human reasoning. Beth had the unsettling feeling that she was being evaluated according to criteria she couldn't begin to understand. Then the dragon did something that caught Beth completely off guard. She looked pointedly at Spark, then at Beth, then down at an old wooden feeding bowl that Beth used for the ranch dogs. The message was unmistakable, and Beth felt a laugh bubble up despite her nervousness. The mighty dragon expected payment for her child's rescue and care, and she was making it clear that breakfast would be acceptable compensation. Beth carefully set Spark down on the porch planks, where he immediately hobbled over to his mother's forefoot and began climbing up her leg with surprising agility. She watched in amazement as the little dragon found a comfortable spot between the great creature's shoulder blades, settling in as naturally as if he were returning to a favorite chair. "I suppose you want something a bit more substantial than dragon kibble," Beth said, addressing the mother dragon directly. To her surprise, the creature made a sound that could have been amusement, a deep rumbling that vibrated through the porch boards. Calculating quickly, Beth realized that preparing breakfast for a dragon this size was going to require most of her emergency food supplies. She had sides of beef in the freezer, but thawing them would take too long. Fresh eggs, milk, and bread might work as a start, but she suspected this magnificent creature would need something more substantial than a human breakfast, as if reading her thoughts. The dragon rose gracefully to her feet and padded down the porch steps toward the pasture where Beth kept her cattle. For a moment, Beth worried that she was about to witness the decimation of her herd, but the dragon simply selected one of the older steers with remarkable precision, a brief burst of flame, and the animal was dispatched so quickly and cleanly that it never knew what happened. The dragon then carefully carried the prepared meat back to the porch and arranged it next to the feeding bowl, looking at Beth expectantly. The message was clear. She had provided the main course and expected Beth to handle the rest of the meal preparation. Over the next hour, Beth found herself in the surreal position of cooking breakfast for a dragon. She prepared scrambled eggs by the dozen, heated gallons of milk, and sliced entire loaves of bread. The dragon waited patiently throughout the process, occasionally making encouraging sounds when Beth brought out additional food items. When the feast was finally ready, spread across multiple large platters and bowls, the dragon ate with surprising delicacy. She used her claws like silverware, tearing meat into manageable pieces and lapping up milk without spilling a drop. Spark joined the meal, though his portions were necessarily smaller, and Beth had to help him with some of the tougher pieces of meat. As they ate together in the growing daylight, Beth began to sense something profound happening. This wasn't just a transaction between species, it was the beginning of a relationship. The dragon's posture and expressions conveyed not just gratitude, but a kind of respect that suggested she understood exactly what Beth had done for her child. When the meal was finished, the dragon made what could only be interpreted as a gesture of thanks. She touched her great head gently to Beth's shoulder, careful not to knock her over with the weight, then settled back onto her haunches and began making a series of complex musical sounds. Beth had the strangest feeling that she was being told something important, a story perhaps about where Spark had come from and how he had ended up injured and alone in that canyon, though she couldn't understand the words. If they were words, the emotional content was clear: loss, worry, determination, and now relief and gratitude. As the twin suns climbed higher into the sky, the dragon showed no signs of leaving. Instead, she appeared to be settling in for an extended stay. She arranged herself comfortably on the large porch, wrapping her tail around herself like a cat. While Spark explored his new environment with obvious delight, Beth realized that her quiet life as a frontier rancher had just become considerably more complicated. But as she watched the two dragons together, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with her own situation. She had helped reunite a family, and that seemed worth whatever challenges might come next. The dragons seemed to understand that Beth needed to continue with her daily work. She watched with interest as Beth went about her morning chores, feeding chickens and checking on the cattle. Once, when Beth was having trouble lifting a heavy feed bag, the dragon delicately picked it up in her jaws and carried it to where it needed to go. By noon, it was clear that the dragon intended to stay for at least another meal. Beth began mentally inventorying her food supplies and wondering how she was going to explain this situation to her neighbors. The nearest ranch was only 5 miles away, and smoke from cooking fires could be seen for great distances in the clear new Terra air. As if summoned by her thoughts, Beth spotted a dust cloud on the horizon that meant visitors were approaching. She felt a moment of panic, wondering how she could possibly explain why there was a 30-foot dragon lounging on her front porch like an enormous house cat. But when she looked at the dragon's calm, patient expression, she realized that this magnificent creature was probably better equipped to handle human reactions than she was. The afternoon sun beat down on the strange tableau: a human rancher, a baby dragon with a splinted leg, and an ancient dragon mother who had decided that this particular porch was exactly where she wanted to be. Beth settled into her favorite rocking chair and waited to see what would happen next, feeling that her quiet frontier life was about to become anything but quiet. The dust cloud on the horizon turned out to be old Pete Morrison from the neighboring ranch, riding his ancient hoverbike that coughed and wheezed its way across the prairie. Beth watched him approach with a mixture of amusement and concern, wondering how the crusty old rancher would react to finding dragons on her front porch. Pete had lived on New Terra longer than almost anyone, having arrived with the second wave of colonists, and he claimed nothing could surprise him anymore. Pete's hoverbike puttered to a stop at the edge of Beth's yard, and he sat there for a long moment, staring at the massive dragon who regarded him with calm interest. Spark peeked out from behind his mother's foreleg, chirping curiously at this new visitor. Finally, Pete shut off his engine, removed his battered hat, and scratched his gray head. "Well, I'll be dipped in quantum flux," Pete said in his gravelly voice. "Beth Carter, you always were one for picking up strays, but this takes the prize." He climbed off his bike with the careful movements of someone whose joints had seen too many new Terra winters. She friendly, or should I be worried about becoming Dragon Barbecue? The mother dragon, whom Beth had started thinking of as Ember because of the way her scales caught the light, made a sound that was unmistakably laughter. She lowered her great head and sniffed delicately at Pete, who stood his ground with the stubborn courage that had kept him alive on the frontier for 50 years. Apparently satisfied with whatever she learned from his scent, Ember settled back into her comfortable position. She's been here since dawn, Beth explained, still amazed by the surreal normalcy of the conversation. I found her baby injured in Razor Canyon yesterday, and she came looking for him. She gestured to where Spark was now attempting to climb onto Pete's hoverbike. Fascinated by the mechanical contraption, Pete nodded slowly, as if dragons appearing on neighbors' porches was a perfectly reasonable development. Always figured they were smarter than folks gave them credit for, he said. My grandfather claimed he saw one of the big ones watching the first settlement being built, just sitting on a ridge like she was taking notes. He pulled out his pipe and began the elaborate process of loading it with tobacco. What's she want, besides breakfast? I think she wants to stay, Beth admitted, at least for a while. She seems to have adopted the place. As if to confirm this, Ember rose gracefully and padded over to Pete's hoverbike, where she gently lifted Spark away from the engine with her teeth and set him down safely. Pete lit his pipe and puffed thoughtfully. Well, she's got good taste in real estate, he said finally. This is prime dragon territory. High ground, good water, plenty of space. He studied Ember with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his life evaluating livestock. She's a beauty, I'll give her that. Probably. Smart as any human, too, from the look in those eyes. Over the following days, Pete proved to be prophetic. Ember did indeed intend to stay, and she began treating Beth's ranch as her home base. Every morning, she appeared on the veranda at exactly sunrise, waiting patiently for breakfast. Beth quickly learned that dragons were creatures of routine and preferred their meals served at consistent times. But Ember wasn't simply a demanding houseguest. She began bringing gifts, starting small but growing increasingly elaborate. The first offering was a cluster of crystals unlike anything Beth had seen in 3 generations of frontier living. They glowed with their own inner light and generated enough heat to warm the entire kitchen on cold mornings. When Beth expressed delight with the crystals, Ember seemed pleased and began expanding her gift-giving. She brought rare minerals that Beth recognized as valuable trade goods, beautiful stones polished to mirror brightness by some unknown process, and occasionally small game animals that she deposited neatly by the kitchen door. The gifts were always presented formally, with Ember watching Beth's reaction carefully, as if her approval mattered greatly. Communication between them evolved rapidly from simple gestures to something approaching actual conversation. Beth discovered that dragons were naturally telepathic, though they had to consciously choose to share thoughts with non-dragons. At first, the mental contact was startling. Sudden flashes of images, emotions, and concepts that weren't her own. But gradually, Beth learned to relax and let the alien thoughts flow through her mind without resistance. Through these brief telepathic exchanges, Beth began to understand Ember's story. The dragon had once been part of a mated pair, raising their young in the high mountain caves that honeycombed New Terra's northern ranges. But off-world poachers had discovered the dragon nesting sites, hunting the great creatures for their scales, bones, and the precious fire glands that powered their flame. Beth Ember's mate had died protecting their territory from a gang of well-armed hunters who used military-grade weapons and energy nets, specifically designed for capturing large creatures. The images that Ember shared of that battle were filled with rage and grief so profound that Beth often had to break the mental connection to avoid being overwhelmed. Since then, Ember had been raising Spark alone, avoiding all contact with humans and teaching her child to fear the settlements. When Spark had wandered too far from their mountain home and been injured in a rockfall, Ember had searched frantically for 3 days before tracking him to Beth's ranch. The revelation that Beth had shown kindness to her child instead of capturing him had challenged everything Ember thought she knew about humans. Through their growing telepathic bond, Beth could feel the dragon's amazement at discovering that not all humans were predators. She had expected to have to fight to retrieve her child. Instead, she had found an ally. As the days passed, Ember began revealing abilities that astounded Beth. The dragon could sense weather patterns days in advance, warning of storms by becoming restless and positioning herself to shield the ranch buildings. She could communicate with other native species, apparently negotiating agreements that kept the more dangerous creatures away from Beth's livestock. Most remarkably, Ember began teaching Beth to understand the complex ecosystem of New Terra in ways that human science had barely begun to explore. Through shared mental images, she showed how the different native species interacted, which plants were edible or medicinal, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in the planetary environment. Word of the unusual partnership spread through the sparse network of frontier ranches faster than Beth had expected. Some neighbors were curious and supportive, like Pete Morrison, who had taken to stopping by regularly to check on his dragon friends. Others were fearful or skeptical, wondering if Beth had lost her mind or somehow been hypnotized by alien influences. The situation became more complicated when representatives from the Colonial Authority arrived to investigate reports of unauthorized contact with indigenous species. 3 officials in clean uniforms and climate-controlled vehicles looked absurdly out of place as they tried to interview Beth, while Ember lounged nearby, occasionally making sounds that seemed suspiciously like disdainful comments. The lead official, a nervous man named Director Hayes, read from an electronic tablet as he explained that all contact with potentially intelligent native species required approval from the Galactic Settlement Commission. Unauthorized interaction could result in fines, loss of land grants, or even deportation back to Earth. He seemed to expect Beth to be intimidated by these threats instead. Beth found herself laughing. "Director, that dragon is more civilized than half the humans I know," she said. "She waits to be invited before entering the house. She cleans up after herself, and she's never once failed to say please and thank you in her own way." As if to demonstrate, Ember politely nudged the feeding bowl with her snout and looked expectantly at Beth. Director Hayes was clearly struggling to categorize a situation that didn't fit any of his bureaucratic procedures. His assistant kept taking photographs of Ember, who posed obligingly but with obvious amusement. The third official, a woman named Researcher Chen, seemed genuinely fascinated and asked intelligent questions about dragon behavior and communication methods. When the officials finally left, promising to file a report with the territorial governor, Ember made a series of sounds that Beth had learned meant acute displeasure. Through their mental link, the dragon shared images of other humans in uniforms, the ones who had killed her mate. Her concern was clear. These new officials might bring more dangerous people that evening. As they shared their usual sunset meal on the veranda, Beth felt the full weight of what they had started. This wasn't just about one dragon and one human anymore. Ember represented her entire species, and every interaction they had was potentially historic. The decisions they made together could determine whether dragons and humans would become allies or remain forever separate. Spark, now almost fully recovered from his injuries, seemed oblivious to the larger implications. He spent his days exploring the ranch, learning to fly in short hops under his mother's watchful eye, and developing an impressive ability to charm extra treats from Beth. His playful antics provided a lightness to the situation that kept the growing tensions from becoming overwhelming. As Beth watched the 2 dragons settle in for the night, Ember's great bulk wrapped protectively around her child, she realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A family that transcended species, a purpose that went beyond mere survival on the frontier, and a partnership that might change the future of human dragon relations forever. The twin moons of New Terra rose high overhead, casting silver light on a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just weeks before. A human rancher and 2 dragons sharing the same home, the same meals and increasingly the same dreams of what their world could become. But even as Beth drifted off to sleep in her rocking chair, she couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful existence was about to be tested in ways none of them could anticipate. The silver streak cutting across New Terra's morning sky looked innocent enough at first glance, just another cargo ship making its routine approach to the territorial spaceport. Beth watched it from her veranda while Ember and Spark shared their breakfast, noting absently that the vessel seemed larger than usual and was coming in at an unusual angle. It wasn't until the ship's registration codes became visible through her binoculars that she felt the first cold touch of dread. The vessel bore the distinctive markings of the Galactic Trade Confederation, but not the clean, administrative ships that brought colonial supplies and official visitors. This was the enforcement cruiser, heavily armed and designed for what the Confederation euphemistically called resource acquisition operations. Beth had heard enough stories from traders and spacers to know that such ships rarely brought good news to frontier worlds. Ember sensed her distress immediately through their growing telepathic bond. The great dragon lifted her head from her morning meal and followed Beth's gaze skyward, her amber eyes narrowing as she studied the approaching vessel. A low rumble began deep in her chest, not quite a growl but definitely a sound of displeasure. Spark, picking up on his mother's mood, moved closer to her protective bulk and made questioning chirps. Within hours, the news spread through the Colonial communication network like wildfire. The Confederation ship had landed at the capital spaceport and immediately demanded a meeting with Governor Martinez and the Colonial Council. Their stated purpose was investigation and enforcement of galactic wildlife protection protocols. Oh, but everyone knew what that really meant. Someone had reported the presence of dragons on New Terra, and the Confederation wanted them. Beth's worst fears were confirmed when Director Hayes arrived at her ranch that afternoon, his usual nervous demeanor replaced by something approaching panic. He climbed out of his government vehicle and approached the veranda where the three companions sat, his hands shaking as he consulted his electronic tablet. "Miss Carter, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation," Hayes began without preamble. "The Confederation has received reports of unauthorized contact with protected indigenous species. They're demanding that any dragons on New Terra be turned over immediately for scientific study and proper containment." Ember's response was immediate and unmistakable. She rose to her full height, wings spreading wide enough to cast shadows across the entire front yard. The sound that emerged from her throat was like controlled thunder, a warning that needed no translation in any language. Spark quickly scrambled up onto his mother's back, sensing that this conversation was about to become very dangerous. "Protected species," Beth repeated, tasting the bitter irony in the words. "Protected by the same people who've been hunting them for their scales and bones." She stood slowly, her hand moving instinctively to the plasma rifle she now kept within easy reach. "Tell me, Director, what kind of protection involves cages and laboratories?" Hayes had the grace to look ashamed. But his duty to the Colonial administration won out over his personal feelings. "The Confederation has legal authority over all non-human intelligent species encountered by human colonies," he said. "If we don't comply, they can impose economic sanctions, cut off our supply lines, even revoke our settlement charter." Through her mental link with Ember, Beth suddenly understood far more than Hayes was saying. The dragon shared a rush of images and emotions. Other worlds, other dragon populations that had been protected by the Confederation until they disappeared entirely. Ships full of dragon scales and bones departing for the luxury markets of the core worlds. Research facilities where captured dragons died slowly in the name of scientific advancement. "They killed her mate," Beth said quietly, and Hayes went pale as he realized she was speaking about information no human should possess. "The poachers who came here before, they were working for the Confederation. They've been systematically hunting dragons across this entire sector of space." Ember's mental voice was like ice and fire combined as she shared more of her species' hidden history. Dragons had once traveled freely between the stars, long before humans developed spaceflight. They had chosen to live quietly on individual worlds, avoiding the younger species that seemed bent on conquest and exploitation. But the Confederation's expansion had made hiding impossible. The great dragon's memories stretched back centuries, revealing a civilization far older and more sophisticated than human scientists had ever imagined. Dragons possessed knowledge of technologies that could revolutionize space travel, energy production, and planetary management. But they had learned through bitter experience that sharing such knowledge with humans only led to enslavement and death. "How many worlds?" Beth asked through their mental connection, and the answer nearly overwhelmed her. Dozens of planets where dragon populations had been harvested to extinction, entire species wiped out to supply the Confederation's endless appetite for exotic materials and alien technologies. Ember's own world had been one of the last strongholds, and now New Terra represented perhaps the final refuge Hayes was backing toward his vehicle, clearly disturbed by Beth's apparent ability to communicate with Ember. "Miss Carter, I understand your attachment to these creatures, but you have to be realistic," he said. "The Confederation has overwhelming force at their disposal. If you resist, they'll simply take the dragons by force and probably arrest you as well." "Then they'll have a fight on their hands," Beth replied, and she felt Ember's fierce approval flowing through their bond. The dragon had spent too many years running and hiding. She was tired of watching her species disappear one world at a time while the Confederation grew fat on their suffering. As Hayes drove away in a cloud of dust and panic, Beth felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one dragon family anymore. This was about whether an ancient and noble species would survive or be driven to extinction by human greed. The choice facing her was simple in concept but terrifying in its implications. Submit to injustice or fight an enemy with virtually unlimited resources. Ember's thoughts flowed into her mind with increasing clarity as their bond deepened. The dragon was sharing not just memories but active knowledge, teaching Beth about her species' true capabilities. Dragons weren't just large flying animals with the ability to breathe fire. They were living libraries of galactic history, their minds capable of processing and storing information in ways that made human computers seem primitive. "Show me everything," Beth whispered, and Ember's response was like diving into an ocean of alien knowledge. Centuries of accumulated wisdom about space travel, planetary engineering, and technologies that the Confederation would kill to possess. But also something more immediate and practical: the locations of other dragon families still hiding in New Terra's remote wilderness. Through Ember's guidance, Beth began to understand that the dragons had been watching human settlement from the beginning, studying the colonists and learning their strengths and weaknesses. They had the ability to communicate across vast distances through telepathic networks that spanned continents. Most importantly, they were not helpless victims waiting to be harvested. As the twin suns set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Beth felt a new determination settling in her chest. The Confederation might have superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated both the intelligence of dragons and the stubborn courage of frontier humans. That night, Ember began calling to her scattered people through channels that human science couldn't detect. Across New Terra's vast wilderness, ancient dragons who had hidden for generations began responding to her summons. They emerged from deep caves and remote mountain peaks, their minds linking together in a network of shared purpose and growing anger. Beth watched in amazement as Spark demonstrated abilities she had never suspected. The young dragon projected holographic images into the air above the veranda, showing the locations of his extended family as they began moving toward predetermined gathering points. What she had thought was a species of individual creatures was actually a collective intelligence of staggering sophistication. "How many?" she asked Ember, and the answer was both encouraging and terrifying. Nearly 100 adult dragons remained on New Terra along with their young, not enough to rebuild their species if scattered across the galaxy, but possibly enough to make the Confederation think twice about easy conquest. As the night deepened and the stars emerged in their alien patterns, Beth realized that the morning would bring either liberation or catastrophe. The Confederation would expect to find helpless animals ready for capture. Instead, they would discover that they had stumbled into a war they were not prepared to fight. Ember's final mental message before settling in for the night was filled with both gratitude and grim determination. Tomorrow would test whether the friendship between one human and one dragon could grow into an alliance capable of challenging the most powerful force in the galaxy. The age of dragons hiding from humanity was about to end. One way or another, dawn came with the thunder of approaching engines as 3 more Confederation ships descended through New Terra's atmosphere like mechanical vultures. Beth stood on her veranda watching the vessels take position around the territorial capital, their weapon systems clearly visible even at this distance. Ember and Spark flanked her, the great dragon's eyes reflecting the morning light like molten gold, as she monitored telepathic communications from her scattered people. The Colonial emergency broadcast began at precisely sunrise, Governor Martinez's strained voice crackling through every communication device on the planet. All citizens were ordered to report any contact with indigenous dragons immediately. Failure to comply would result in charges of interfering with Confederation wildlife protection operations. Anyone harboring dragons would be considered enemies of lawful galactic authority. Beth turned off the radio with a gesture of disgust. She had spent her entire life on New Terra, had helped build this colony with her own hands, and now some distant bureaucrats were telling her that protecting an injured child made her a criminal. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same organization claiming to protect dragons had spent decades hunting them to extinction. "Time to see what our neighbors are really made of," she said to Ember, who responded with a rumble of agreement. Together they had spent the night contacting every ranch and settlement within 100 miles, using both human communication networks and dragon telepathy to spread a simple message. The dragons were not animals to be captured. They were allies offering partnership. The first test came sooner than expected. Old Pete Morrison arrived on his hover bike just as the Confederation ships were setting up patrol routes, his weathered face grim with determination. Behind him came a convoy of vehicles from neighboring ranches. Farmers, miners, traders, and frontier families who had decided that their freedom was worth fighting for. "Figured you might need some company," Pete said as he climbed off his bike. "Sarah Chen from the Eastern Valley brought her whole family. Says if the Confederation wants dragons, they'll have to go through her first." He gestured to where a dozen children were climbing out of hover trucks, their parents armed with hunting rifles and mining equipment that could serve as weapons. Beth felt a surge of pride in her fellow colonists. These were people who had left everything behind on Earth to build new lives on a dangerous frontier world. They understood better than most that freedom was something you had to fight to keep. The Confederation might have expected easy compliance from isolated farmers, but they had seriously underestimated frontier stubborn. Ember began, making complex musical sounds that carried across the valley like a song. Within minutes, the sky filled with wings as dragons emerged from hiding places that humans had never suspected. They came in all sizes and colors, ancient creatures whose scales had turned silver with age, young adults in their prime, and adolescents like Spark who rode the wind with joyful abandon. The sight was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Nearly 100 dragons circling overhead, their combined presence turning the morning air itself into something electric with power. Beth had known intellectually that Ember's people were intelligent, but seeing them in formation revealed the truth. This was a military force that had been hiding in plain sight for generations through her mental link with Ember. Beth began to understand the true scope of what the dragons were offering: advanced knowledge that could make New Terra completely independent of Confederation trade, energy technologies that would eliminate the need for imported power, cells, agricultural techniques that could turn the planet's harsh landscape into a garden world. But the dragons wanted something in return: a formal alliance that would recognize them as equal partners rather than exotic pets or research subjects. They were tired of hiding, tired of watching their people disappear one world at a time. If humanity could prove itself worthy of trust, the dragons were prepared to share secrets that would reshape galactic civilization. The first Confederation hovercraft appeared over the valley at noon, its sensors sweeping the area for signs of dragon activity. What they found instead was a carefully prepared reception committee, 24 armed colonists standing in neat formation while overhead, dragons performed aerial maneuvers that demonstrated both their intelligence and their complete lack of fear. Captain Rodriguez of the Confederation Enforcement Division landed his craft in Beth's front yard and emerged wearing full combat armor. His confidence visibly wavered as he took in the scene. Dragons perched on rooftops like enormous cats, children playing with baby dragons in the yard, and colonists who looked more amused than intimidated by his arrival. By authority of the Galactic Trade Confederation, I order you to surrender all indigenous creatures for proper scientific evaluation, Rodriguez announced, his voice amplified by his suit's speakers. Resistance to lawful Confederation orders is a serious crime. Sarah Chen stepped forward, her mining laser casually aimed in Rodriguez's direction. Captain, I've been living on this world for 20 years, she said, conversational. These dragons have been here a lot longer than that. Seems to me you're the ones who need permission to be here. The standoff that followed was tense but brief. Rodriguez found himself facing not just armed colonists, but dragons, who clearly understood the situation and were prepared to act. When he tried to raise his weapon, Ember simply breathed a small puff of flame that turned the grass at his feet into a perfect circle of ash. The message was unmistakable. She could have incinerated him entirely if she had chosen to. This is illegal resistance to Confederation. Authority. Rodriguez tried again, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Beth could see him calculating odds and realizing that his small force was vastly outnumbered by opponents who held every advantage. The dragons controlled the air, the colonists knew the terrain, and his own troops looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Ember chose that moment to demonstrate why the Confederation had been so eager to capture dragons. She projected images directly into the minds of everyone present, showing the true history of human-dragon interactions. Worlds stripped bare of their dragon populations, research facilities where captured dragons died in agony, trade ships loaded with scales, bones, and other dragon remains bound for luxury markets. The revelation hit the Confederation troops like a physical blow. Several of them removed their helmets and stared at their captain in horror. They had been told they were protecting an endangered species, not participating in genocide. When Rodriguez ordered them to prepare for combat, half his squad refused to follow orders. Captain, Beth said into the growing silence, your bosses made one big mistake. They assumed dragons were just animals, but these people have been watching your organization for centuries. They know exactly what you've been doing to their families. Through Ember's telepathic network, Beth could sense other confrontations happening across New Terra. Dragon-human teams were peacefully surrounding Confederation forces at every landing site. No shots had been fired yet, but the message was clear. The days of easy dragon hunting were over. The breakthrough came when researcher Chen, the scientist who had been genuinely interested in dragon behavior, stepped forward and removed her own helmet. Captain, I joined this expedition because I believed we were conducting legitimate research, she said. But what I'm seeing here changes everything. These creatures are clearly intelligent partners, not research subjects. Her defection triggered a cascade of surrenders as other Confederation personnel realized they had been lied to about the true nature of their mission. Within hours, only the hardcore enforcement officers remained loyal to their original orders, and they found themselves vastly outnumbered by their own former colleagues. As the sun set on what would later be remembered as Liberation Day, Beth stood on her veranda watching dragons and humans work together to establish the terms of their new alliance. The Confederation ships remained grounded, their crews under gentle but firm detention while Colonial leaders and dragon elders negotiated the future. Ember's thoughts flowed into Beth's mind with satisfaction and hope. For the first time in centuries, dragons didn't have to hide. They could emerge from their mountain caves and take their rightful place as partners in building a better world. The knowledge they possessed could transform not just New Terra, but every human colony that chose cooperation over exploitation. Spark, now confident enough to fly extended patrols with the adult dragons, returned with news that more Confederation ships were approaching. But this time, the dragons were ready. They had allies among the humans. They had revealed their true capabilities, and they had chosen to make their stand on a world where freedom still meant something. The battle for New Terra was won, but Beth knew the larger war was just beginning. The Confederation wouldn't accept the loss of an entire planet's worth of dragons without retaliation. But for tonight, She was content to watch children play with baby dragons in her yard while their parents planned a future that neither species could achieve alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new possibilities. The age of human dominance over dragons was ending. The age of true partnership was about to begin. 6 months after what historians would call the New Terra liberation, Beth woke to the familiar sound of dragon wings overhead. But instead of the desperate flight patterns of creatures in hiding, these were the confident formations of a people reclaiming their sky. Through her bedroom window she could see Spark leading a patrol of young dragons past the ranch. His adult size now impressive, though he remained smaller and more agile than his massive mother. The transformation of New Terra had exceeded even Ember's most optimistic predictions. The Dragon-Human alliance had proven so successful that the planet now produced everything it needed for complete independence. Advanced crystalline power sources developed from dragon knowledge had replaced all imported energy systems. Agricultural techniques shared by the Earthwise dragons had turned marginal farmland into abundant fields that fed not just the colony, but provided surplus for trade. Beth dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where the morning routine had evolved far beyond her wildest imagination. The veranda that had once barely accommodated Ember now hosted a rotating breakfast gathering of dragon families from across the planet. Each morning brought different guests, but the tradition of sharing the first meal together had become sacred to both species. This morning's visitors included Elder Moonscale, an ancient silver dragon whose memory stretched back to the first human ships arriving on New Terra. She had emerged from a hidden mountain sanctuary only after Beth's alliance with Ember proved that some humans could be trusted. Beside her sat Thunderwing, a magnificent blue-black dragon whose specialty was weather control and long-range communication. The morning reports are encouraging, Moonscale conveyed through the telepathic network that now included several dozen humans. The Confederation, ships that departed last week have spread word of our alliance throughout 3 star systems. Colonial governors are requesting dragon ambassadors for their own worlds. Beth smiled as she prepared the expanded breakfast feast that had become her daily joy. Cooking for dragons had taught her patience, creativity, and the deep satisfaction of feeding friends who truly appreciated good food. The dragons had initially been puzzled by human food preparation, but they had quickly developed sophisticated palates and now contributed their own culinary knowledge to create fusion dishes that delighted both species. Spark bounded onto the veranda with the enthusiasm that had never left him, despite his growth into a formidable young adult. His telepathic voice bubbled with excitement as he shared news from his morning patrol. 3 ships approaching from the Kepler system. They're broadcasting friendship codes and requesting permission to establish diplomatic contact. The success of the New Terra model had indeed spread, faster than anyone anticipated. Word of a human colony that had achieved true partnership with an indigenous intelligent species had captured imaginations across the frontier. Colonies struggling with hostile environments, resource shortages, or simple isolation were eager to learn if similar alliances might be possible on their own worlds. Not all of them will have dragons, Thunderwing observed with amusement. But the principles we've established here could work with any intelligent species willing to trust humans enough to reveal themselves. Through the growing network of dragon-enhanced communication, Beth had learned that New Terra's revolution was already inspiring changes throughout the galaxy. Colonies were questioning Confederation trade policies that kept them dependent on expensive imports. Scientists were demanding access to the dragon-shared technologies that could solve energy and environmental problems. Most importantly, people were beginning to ask why advanced alien species should be protected rather than respected as equals. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. The Confederation had imposed economic sanctions and threatened military intervention. But other human colonies had begun offering direct trade relationships that bypassed Confederation control entirely. The dragon-enhanced technologies that New Terra now produced were so advanced that traditional trade goods seemed primitive. By comparison, Beth's role had evolved from simple rancher to something approaching an ambassador between species. Her ranch had become the unofficial center of human-dragon cooperation, where new colonists came to learn peaceful contact protocols, and young dragons practiced their communication skills with humans. She had never wanted to be a political figure, but circumstances had thrust her into a position where her decisions affected the future of two civilizations. The morning council meeting will address the Rigel colony request, Ember announced as she settled into her favorite spot on the expanded veranda. The great dragon's presence still filled Beth with awe, but familiarity had bred deep affection rather than fear. They've discovered what appears to be an intelligent crystalline species but haven't been able to establish communication. These requests for help had become common as word spread about New Terra's success. Colonies encountering alien species they couldn't understand were asking for dragon assistance in making first contact. The dragon's ancient experience with different forms of intelligence made them natural diplomats for species that thought in ways humans couldn't immediately comprehend. We'll need to send a full diplomatic team, Beth mused, mentally calculating logistics. At least 2 adult dragons, a human cultural specialist, and probably some of the younger generation who learn new communication methods faster. Spark's excitement was palpable as he realized he might be chosen for such a mission. The young dragons had proven especially gifted at bridging communication gaps, their minds flexible enough to adapt to alien thought patterns, while their human friendships gave them insight into both species' perspectives. The breakfast gathering gradually dispersed as various dragons departed for their daily responsibilities. Some worked with human engineers to improve planetary infrastructure. Others taught human children about New Terra's ecology, while learning human mathematics and science in return. A few maintained the long-distance communication network that now connected New Terra with dragon populations on dozens of other worlds. As the crowd thinned, Beth found herself alone with Ember and Spark, just as in the early days of their partnership. But everything had changed since that morning when an injured baby dragon had transformed a simple rancher into the catalyst for galactic revolution. The quiet veranda had become the heart of an alliance that was reshaping human-alien relations throughout the galaxy. "Do you ever regret it?" Beth asked through their mental link. Coming out of hiding, trusting humans enough to reveal what dragons really are. Ember's response was complex, layered with memories of loss and hope, fear and determination. Every species faces moments when they must choose between safety and growth, she conveyed. Dragons chose safety for too long. We watched worlds die and people suffer because we were afraid to risk trust. You showed us that the risk was worth taking. The sound of approaching engines interrupted their conversation. Beth looked up to see a familiar convoy approaching, Colonial representatives, visiting scientists and delegations from 3 different star systems. The ranch that had once been a quiet outpost had become a pilgrimage site for anyone interested in the future of human-alien cooperation. Ready for another day of changing the galaxy? Beth asked with a grin, and felt both dragons' amusement flowing through their shared bond. As the visitors arrived and the day's diplomatic sessions began, Beth reflected on how far they had all come. The cowgirl who had found a lost baby. Dragon was now helping to write the protocols for peaceful contact between species. The mother dragon who had come for breakfast had become the architect of a new kind of galactic civilization. The Confederation still threatened and schemed from their distant power centers, but their monopoly on human-alien relations was crumbling. Every successful alliance, every peaceful contact, every colony that achieved independence through cooperation rather than exploitation weakened their hold on the galaxy. More importantly, the children growing up on New Terra and similar alliance worlds would never know a time when humans and aliens were automatically enemies. Spark's generation of dragons played freely with human children, learning together and growing together, in ways that made the old fears seem ancient and foolish. As the twin suns climbed higher into the clear New Terra sky, Beth watched a sight that still filled her with wonder. Dragons and humans working side by side, their combined knowledge and abilities creating possibilities that neither species could achieve alone. The morning that had begun with a simple breakfast on a frontier ranch had become the foundation for a new chapter in galactic history. The age of exploration and exploitation was ending. The age of cooperation and mutual respect was just beginning, and somewhere in the vast galaxy, other species were watching New Terra's example, and wondering if they too might find the courage to step out of the shadows and reach for partnership. Beth smiled as she prepared for another day of meetings, negotiations, and the careful work of building trust between worlds. Every morning still began with breakfast on the veranda, but now those meals fed dreams that stretched across the stars.